The Boston night was painted in shades of sleet and silence. Snow fell not like soft confetti, but like whispered threats hissing against the windshield of the midnight blue Tesla gliding down a desolate stretch of the Charles River Parkway. Inside the car, Ethan Prescott, reclusive, tech tycoon architect of a $9 billion biotech empire, gripped the steering wheel with the same surgical precision he applied to everything in his life. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't feel. He hadn't allowed himself that luxury in 4 years. His jaw was set elegant, yet hardened the reflection of city lights carving sharp lines across his chiseled features. Behind his glacier gray eyes lived ghosts, one of them, with a name no one dared say aloud anymore, Amelia. Some said he lost his heart the day she died. Others said he never had one to begin with. But tonight Ethan wasn't thinking about grief, or about Amelia's name etched onto the plaque in his corporate lobby, or about the silent war in the boardroom where his once loyal co-founder, Spencer Granger, was circling like a vulture. No, Ethan was focused on a single closing and acquisition that could define or destroy his legacy. And then in an instant, all control vanished. A flash of black ice, a gut-wrenching swerve. The Tesla spun violently, metal shrieking glass, erupting into the night, the world turning upside down in slow, cruel spirals, before crashing into a barrier with the thunderous finality of fate itself. And then nothing. Silence cold. A bleeding breath beneath the snow. The trauma bay at St. Adelaide Medical Center was lit with sterile white, but the energy inside pulsed with urgency. Nurses moved like dancers in practiced chaos, beeping monitors, rushing gurneys, voices calling vitals like sacred chants. Dr. Celeste Monroe had just clocked into her night shift, her dark curls still damp from walking through the storm, her warm brown eyes sharper than any scalpel. She was Boston's rising trauma star, 30 years old, Harvard-trained, second-generation physician, and the reason half of her ER team still believed in miracles. But no miracle prepared her for what came through those sliding doors at 1:32 a.m. Male, late 30s, head trauma, probable tibial fracture, hypotensive GCS score 8. The paramedic rattled off breathless. Driver in high-speed MVA. Lost consciousness at the scene. Name's Ethan Prescott. Celeste's breath caught just for a moment. Everyone in Boston knew the name. The media had crowned him the Iceman of innovation. But the man on the stretcher didn't look like a titan. His custom wool coat was soaked in blood, his once pristine features pale, his hand twitching like a child in a nightmare. She leaned over him, placing a gloved hand on his chest. Ethan, you're at St. Adelaide. You were in an accident. Can you hear me? His eyelids fluttered. Then his lips parted. Stay with me, Celeste stilled. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them, not as a command, but a plea. I'm here, she whispered. And she meant it. The hours blurred into a delicate balance of science and soul. Celeste intubated, stabilized, and led the trauma team with a calm born of instinct and experience. But something about this patient stirred an ache beneath her professionalism. Not admiration, not pity, something more dangerous. Recognition. This was a man built on walls, and she knew all too well what it meant to build them. She had hers too, brick by brick, since she was 16, and her father collapsed at the dinner table, leaving her family in a mountain of grief and medical debt. Since then, her world had been about precision, stability, no surprises. And yet tonight, lying unconscious on her table, was the first man in years who made her question the line between care and connection. Vital stabilizing, her resident confirmed at dawn. He'll need surgery for the leg fracture, but he's out of critical. Celeste nodded, and yet her eyes lingered on his face longer than they should have. She turned away quickly, chastising herself. Boundaries, Monroe. He's just another patient. But even as she walked out of the trauma bay, she knew it wasn't true. Something had shifted. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city was wrapped in a stillness so fragile it felt holy. And inside St. Adelaide, a storm far more complex had just begun, one not found on Doppler radar, but in the silent collision of two lives forever altered by a single night. If this story has already pulled you into its quiet storm, don't let the moment pass. Let us know what moved you. Drop a comment below. Like this video if you're already falling for what comes next. And if you're curious how this connection might evolve from trauma into something that heals even the deepest wounds, hit that follow button. The journey is only just beginning. Morning crept into Boston like a shy guest, its golden light tiptoeing across the rooftop helipads in Misted Harbor. Within the sterile halls of St. Adelaide Medical Center, the night's chaos had quieted to a hush. Monitors beeped like whispers, and the heavy storm had retreated, leaving behind a frozen hush that blanketed the city in white stillness. Dr. Celeste Monroe stood at the observation window of ICU room 407. Arms crossed, a tablet cradled loosely in one hand. Her coffee had long gone cold, forgotten on a nearby counter. Through the glass, she watched as a team of nurses adjusted IV lines and recorded vital signs. On the hospital bed lay Ethan Prescott, wrapped in bandages and silence. He didn't move, not a twitch. Only the soft rise and fall of his chest confirmed that he was still tethered to this world. But Celeste couldn't stop watching him. Not because he was a billionaire, not because every news anchor in Boston was scrambling to confirm his accident, but because something in him defied everything she thought she knew about people like him. The press painted Ethan as a cold-blooded genius, a recluse with nerves of steel and a heart of stone. They spoke of a man who hadn't attended a gala in 4 years, who fired senior executives by email, who refused all interviews unless they were printed in medical journals. An investor who had built one of the most powerful biotech companies in the world, Aurelia Systems, by turning tragedy into data. But that wasn't the man who had clutched her hand in the trauma bay, blue-gray eyes glassy with pain, whispering, "Stay with me," like it was a secret he'd never said aloud. And it wasn't the man who now lay still, fragile, human, and impossibly alone. Celeste glanced at his chart again. Concussion, compound tibial fracture, 3 broken ribs, severe contusions. But it wasn't the physical damage that concerned her. It was the quiet. The way he hadn't made a single demand since waking. Most CEOs she'd treated barked orders from their stretchers. Not Ethan. He'd only opened his eyes once in surgery, and when he did, he'd said nothing about work. Only her name. Celeste, he'd murmured, barely audible. It had shocked her. He'd remembered. No patient ever remembered that. Later that afternoon, she returned to his room alone. The nurses had rotated out. The monitors had settled into a rhythmic calm. Snowlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a faint glow over his angular features. He was awake. Barely, but enough. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, like a man surfacing from deep water. Then they found her. "Dr. Monroe," he rasped. Her breath caught. She stepped forward carefully, like any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "Good afternoon, Mr. Prescott." He blinked. "You were there when it happened?" "Yes." She moved to his side, checking his vitals without breaking eye contact. "You were in a car accident. We performed surgery on your leg. You're stable, but you'll need time to heal." He nodded once, though the motion seemed to cost him. "Thank you." His voice was rough but gentle, and in it Celeste heard something she hadn't expected. Sincerity, real gratitude. Not the rehearsed lines of a polished executive, but something quieter, more rare. "I'm just doing my job," she replied. "No," he said, eyes closing for a moment. "You did more than that. You anchored me. I heard your voice before I saw anything else." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "You were unconscious," she said softly. "I know," his lips tilted into something like a smile. "But I remember your hand, your voice. It was calm." Celeste looked away, hiding the emotion rising behind her composed expression. She wasn't used to patients seeing her like this. Not the woman behind the white coat. "Your company will be reaching out soon, I imagine," she said, changing the subject. "Your team, your family." "No family," he murmured. The words hung between them like unfinished prayers. "No one at all." He shook his head faintly. "Just board members and lawyers. They'll come for the company. Not for me." The bitterness in his tone was fleeting, but it pierced her more deeply than she expected. Celeste hesitated, then pulled a chair closer to the bed. You should rest, she said gently. Your body's been through a lot. He studied her for a moment, and in that quiet scrutiny, she felt as though he were seeing her, not just as a doctor, but as a person. Will you stay, he asked. The question was so simple, so unguarded. Celeste looked at the monitors, then at the man lying broken beneath the wires and bandages. For a second, she saw past the headlines, past the power and the fortune and the icy reputation. And all she saw was a man with no one. Yes, she whispered, for a little while. So she stayed, not because she had to, but because somehow she knew that this stillness, this strange tentative trust was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. And outside the snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in quiet promise. Sabrina Suritortum. The snow had not stopped. It softened the edges of Boston's skyline, cloaking the city in a fragile hush, like the breath between two heartbeats. From the sixth floor of St. Adelaide Medical Center, Dr. Celeste Monroe watched it fall in gentle spirals, her reflection a faint ghost in the glass. Behind her, the muffled sounds of the ICU filtered through the quiet, the rhythmic pulse of a cardiac monitor, the gentle hiss of oxygen, the low hum of voices in the hallway. She should have been reviewing patient charts. There were lab results to check, discharge summaries to finalize. But her thoughts lingered on a man whose presence had become increasingly difficult to compartmentalize. Ethan Prescott. It had been 4 days since the crash. 4 days since the reclusive billionaire with the famously impenetrable exterior had arrived at her hospital broken in body, but strangely open. She told herself she was simply doing her job, monitoring his pain, overseeing physical therapy, checking on his concussion symptoms. But each time she entered room 4-7, she felt it, the shift in air, the invisible thread tugging something deeper. And now she was being asked to cross a line she had vowed never to blur. Celeste stood outside the administrative wing of the hospital, a tablet pressed to her chest like a shield. Inside the conference room, Aurelius Systems' legal counsel and two stone-faced representatives from Boston's elite care private agency were waiting for her answer. I'm sorry you want me to be his private physician, she repeated slowly. Yes, said Robert Ames, Ethan's assistant, a lean man with wire-frame glasses and the air of someone who hadn't slept in days. Mr. Prescott is being discharged in 72 hours. He refuses rehab facilities. He insists on recovering at home. And he insists on you. Celeste's brows rose. There are dozens of private care physicians in the city. One's trained in post-op rehabilitation. He doesn't trust anyone else. Her fingers tensed around the tablet. Trust. That word was a dangerous slope. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Look, Dr. Monroe, I know this is unconventional, but Ethan has authorized triple your current rate, full housing, discretionary privacy terms, and a contract through Elite Care, so your license isn't at risk. I didn't ask about the money, she said evenly. Silence settled. Then Robert exhaled. Between you and me, I don't think it's just about the care. I think he's scared. And I think you're the first person in years who made him feel something other than empty. The words hit harder than expected. Celeste glanced away. He's my patient. He's also a man alone in the world, Robert said quietly. Sometimes people don't need the best. They just need the one who stayed. 3 days later, the sun broke through the snow for the first time since the crash. A soft winter light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's Beacon Hill penthouse, dancing across Italian marble and pristine leather. Everything gleamed, everything ordered cold, perfect, lifeless. Celeste stood in the entryway, suitcase in hand, her heart a taut wire beneath her coat. She wasn't a stranger to opulence. She'd cared for celebrities, CEOs, even senators. But none of them had unsettled her like this man. She heard his voice before she saw him. I don't like that vase. She turned toward the open living area. Ethan was seated in a wheelchair, one leg elevated, his cast neatly wrapped. He was dressed in a charcoal cashmere robe, pale but alert, every inch of him curated, but for his eyes, which still held that quiet storm. I beg your pardon, she asked. He pointed toward a massive floral arrangement, white lilies and red roses on the central table. Too funereal. Reminds me of Amelia's memorial. Celeste blinked, noted. A beat passed. You came, he said. I did. You could have said no. I almost did. He studied her eyes, narrowing. Why didn't you? She lifted her chin. Because you asked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then Ethan nodded as if some unspoken battle had ended with her presence. The first 48 hours were an exercise in tension. Ethan refused painkillers stronger than acetaminophen, refused to stay off conference calls, refused to acknowledge fatigue even when his head swam with dizziness. Celeste, for her part, maintained a careful distance, clinical, composed, deliberate, until the third night. She found him slumped sideways in his wheelchair, a laptop balanced on his lap, his skin ashen. His breathing was shallow, his jaw clenched in pain. Ethan, she said sharply, rushing to him, what the hell are you doing? I had to finish reviewing R&D projections. You're actively hemorrhaging energy, and you're worried about a profit curve. He didn't respond, only looked up at her, something dark and raw in his gaze. I don't know how to stop, he whispered. Celeste froze. The words were not just about work. They were about loss, about guilt, about the kind of hollow that follows you home and curls beside your heartbeat at night. You don't have to stop, she said, kneeling beside him. You just have to let someone else help carry it. He stared at her like she was the last light left in the storm. Then slowly, Ethan reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a folded legal document. She took it confused. What's this? A proposal. She blinked. Excuse me. A contract, he clarified. I want to extend your care. Not for weeks, months. I want consistency. I want... His voice faltered. I want you. Celeste's breath hitched. You're not just another nurse, Celeste. You're the only one I let near the parts of me I don't show anyone else. She stood, her pulse thudding. I came to care for your injuries. That's it. He looked at her then, without arrogance, without calculation. Just a man deeply and utterly exposed. I know, but the truth is, I don't want to heal if you're not the one walking me through it. Celeste didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, she walked to the window, looking out over the frozen skyline, her heart unraveling thread by thread. Somewhere between duty and emotion, she had already crossed a line. And now, the snow wasn't the only thing falling. Someone. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows in quiet shafts of gold, slicing across polished surfaces and untouched art. For all its grandeur, Ethan Prescott's Beacon Hill home felt like a monument imposing, beautiful, and hollow. It wasn't a place built for living, it was a fortress. And like all fortresses, it was designed to keep the world out. But something had changed in recent days. It wasn't the elegant drapes now slightly askew. It wasn't the half-empty tea mug resting beside the bed, instead of perfectly aligned on a tray. It wasn't even the faint scent of chamomile and antiseptic that lingered like an echo of presence. It was her. Dr. Celeste Monroe had been living under Ethan's roof for 2 weeks. What began as a professional arrangement, temporary clinical, had become something neither of them could name. She moved through the space with a calm certainty, both healer and mirror, pressing into the cracks of his solitude with quiet persistence. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, Ethan had begun to depend on her. The day began with friction. I said, I'm fine. You're not. Ethan's voice was taut, already fraying at the edges. He sat stiffly in the wheelchair beside the fireplace, one hand bracing his ribs as Celeste adjusted the compression sleeve on his leg. You're pale, your blood pressure's up, and your pain response is elevated. That is not fine. He looked away. You're overreacting. No, she said evenly. You're deflecting, again. His jaw ticked. You're not my therapist. No, she murmured, tightening the strap gently. But I am the person trying to keep you from undoing your own recovery. Silence. Then Ethan exhaled a bitter breath. I'm not used to this. Being challenged. Being seen. Celeste straightened her hand, brushing his forearm before retreating. It's not weakness to be witnessed, Ethan. He met her gaze, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, like the lingering warmth from a hand that had only just let go. That evening, the power flickered as the wind howled off the harbor. The penthouse, always dim and quiet by design, took on a kind of fragile intimacy. Celeste sat in the reading nook, scrolling through patient updates on her tablet. She wore navy joggers and a soft Henley shirt, her hair loosely tied back, her bare feet tucked beneath her. Ethan watched her from across the room. He didn't mean to, but lately she pulled at his attention the way gravity pulls the tide. It wasn't just her beauty, though. That too was impossible to ignore. It was the way she existed so comfortably within herself, unapologetically human, and so unlike the curated chaos of his world. He remembered a time when stillness terrified him. Now he feared the day she'd leave and take this calm with her. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Celeste looked up. "Of course. Why medicine?" She smiled faintly, setting the tablet aside. "You mean why not something easier, something less exhausting?" His lips tilted in acknowledgement. She leaned back, eyes drifting toward the skyline. "My father was a mechanic, hands always dirty, but he had this gift: he could fix anything. Didn't matter how broken. When I was little, I thought he had magic." Her voice softened. "He died when I was 16. Massive cardiac arrest. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. And I remember thinking if only I had gotten there first, maybe I could have fixed him." Ethan swallowed. "So you became the mechanic?" She nodded. "For people." A quiet settled over them, thick and full. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be. That pain shaped me. It taught me to love what's fragile." She looked at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that made him feel both exposed and whole. "Do you believe people can change?" he asked suddenly. Celeste tilted her head. "I believe we all carry scars, but some of us choose to grow around them instead of inside them." Ethan's voice lowered. "And do you think I'm still growing inside mine?" "I think—" She paused. "I think your walls were built for survival, not for shelter, and you've been mistaking one for the other." The words landed with startling precision. He looked away. "What if I don't know how to live without them?" "Then we learn," she said gently, "together." Later that night, Celeste entered his bedroom with fresh bandages. She knocked first, though he always said she didn't need to. He was seated at the edge of the bed, shirtless, struggling to remove the brace on his ribs. His breath hitched as he moved. "Let me," she said, crossing the room. Their hands brushed. The air shifted. Celeste worked silently, fingers steady, as she unfastened the brace and checked the bruising. Her touch was clinical but tender. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Less," he murmured. "When you're near—" She froze. Their eyes met. "Ethan, I know this is complicated," he said, voice low, "but you walk through my walls like they don't exist. You see me without asking for the mask." "You're my patient," she whispered, the protest weak even to her own ears. His hand rose, cupping her wrist gently. "Then discharge me." "Don't joke." "I'm not." Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers. She should have stepped back, should have shut this down before it reached the edge. But her heart betrayed her first. "You terrify me," she admitted, "because of who I am." "No, because of who I am around you." For a breathless second, they hovered in that liminal space between the rules that protected them and the feelings that betrayed them. And then mercifully, impossibly, the doorbell rang. They broke apart like waves crashing against stone. Celeste's cheeks flushed as she turned away, breath, shaky hands trembling. Ethan exhaled, his voice hoarse. "That's probably Robert, or another nurse agency coming to fire you for ethics violations." She half laughed, then touched the edge of his brace. "I'll finish this later." He watched her go, and when the door closed behind her, the room felt colder, emptier, like something sacred had slipped through his fingers. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows like a confession never spoken. Inside, the fortress had cracked, and the light was beginning to pour in. It had started with silence. Not the strained kind that follows an argument, or the polite pause between two professionals avoiding something unsaid, but the intimate stillness that lingers when the air grows too heavy with possibility. Celeste Monroe stood in the kitchen of Ethan Prescott's Beacon Hill penthouse, stirring a pot of ginger and lemongrass broth she'd made from scratch. The wind outside howled against the glass, and rain had replaced snow falling in long silver strands down the windows. Ethan sat at the marble island nursing a mug of herbal tea she'd made him drink each night to help with inflammation. His casted leg rested on a cushioned stool, his arms folded, his eyes on her, not with the cold detachment he once wore like armor, but with something deeper, something entirely human. Do you always cook for your patients? He asked quietly. Celeste stirred the pot, lips curving. Only the ones too stubborn to admit they need comfort. I'm not stubborn. You refused pain meds and physical therapy for 4 days straight. That's not stubborn, he said, feigning indignation. That's selective control. She laughed, a soft, surprised sound that bounced warmly off the granite and tile. He leaned back, watching her. There was something hypnotic about her presence, the way she moved through the space like it had always belonged to her. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't performing, wasn't adjusting herself to fit his world. And maybe that's why she'd become the most dangerous person he'd ever let near his heart. They ate by the wide window overlooking the blurred cityscape beyond the rain. The lights of Boston shimmered like scattered coins tossed across dark water. Conversation moved gently between them. Childhood memories, Celeste's favorite jazz records, Ethan's unexpected obsession with bonsai trees. They didn't speak about business or injury or rules. For a little while, they were simply two people side by side navigating the quiet. After dinner, Celeste stood to clear the dishes. Ethan moved to help and winced as he twisted too fast. She was beside him in a moment. Hey, slow down. I'm fine, he said through clenched teeth. You keep saying that, she replied, helping him steady himself. Their hands touched fingers, curling together unintentionally, and neither of them moved. He looked at her. She looked at him. The air between them tightened, charged, humming with something both familiar and foreign. I should go check your medication log, she said, but didn't step away. You don't have to pretend this isn't happening, Ethan murmured. Celeste's breath caught. I'm not pretending, she said softly. I'm trying not to fall. And in that suspended second, the world around them blurred. There was only the closeness, the shared breath, the unspoken truth rising between heartbeats. Then without planning, without permission, he leaned in. She didn't move. His lips touched hers with the hesitancy of someone afraid to hope. Not demanding, not possessive, just there. Like a whisper, like a question. And she answered. Her fingers found the edge of his jaw, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, but never hurried. It was the kind of kiss that unraveled time, that quieted grief, that reminded two broken people that they were still alive. But as quickly as it began, it ended. Celeste pulled back, first breath, trembling, her eyes wide. Ethan's forehead touched hers for a lingering second before she stepped away, arms crossed as if trying to contain everything that had just been released. That shouldn't have happened, she whispered. I know. A beat. I'm your patient, she said, her voice quieter now. This crosses every line I've ever sworn to uphold. He looked down, shame flickering across his features. I didn't mean to, he began. Yes, you did, she interrupted gently, and so did I. The words hovered like fog between them. She turned to go, needing space, needing air, needing something to anchor her again. But Ethan's voice stopped her. Tell me how to fix this. She paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame. This isn't a broken thing to fix, Ethan, she said. It's a boundary we stepped over. And now, we have to decide if we step back or fall all the way. He didn't answer, and neither did she. Because the truth was, they already knew the answer. It had been written in the spaces between glances, in the late-night talks, in the quiet comfort of shared silences. In the moment her hand first rested on his pulse and found it racing not from pain, but from her. But knowing the truth and accepting it were two different battles, and Celeste wasn't ready to lose everything she'd built to win something that still felt like a risk. So she left the room, and behind her Ethan sat alone, lips still tingling from a kiss that shouldn't have happened, but had. And somehow it had shaken him more than the crash that brought her into his life. Finora. The next morning brought a silence that was colder than the rain. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, dressed in a gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks, his casted legs stretched out stiffly in front of him. The once soothing hum of the city outside now pressed against the windows, like an unwanted guest, its rhythm out of sync with his heartbeat. Celeste hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to him since the kiss. She had returned to her role as physician with meticulous precision, checking vitals, adjusting medications, scheduling therapy, with a gentle, almost mechanical detachment. She hadn't mentioned the way their lips had found each other the night before. She hadn't looked at him the same way. And that absence more than her silence was what burned. Still, Ethan understood. Maybe better than she realized. Love for him had always been a memory written in someone else's handwriting, a thing observed, not lived. But today the past was not content to remain buried. Today his mother was coming. The knock came precisely at 11. Ethan shifted in his chair, face stealing into the mask he wore so well, the one made of cool indifference and polished detachment. Celeste stood nearby, arms folded instinctively, sensing the shift in energy. The housekeeper opened the door, and Margot Prescott stepped in like a winter gust, sharp-tailored and disapproving. She wore a houndstooth coat and pearls at her throat, her gray hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood as she approached her son, her eyes scanning the space with clinical efficiency. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting. Ethan's lips barely curved. "Nice to see you too, Mother." She leaned down and kissed his cheek barely, then turned to Celeste. "And you must be the nurse." Celeste offered a polite smile. "Dr. Celeste Monroe. I'm Ethan's attending physician." Margot blinked once. "Ah, a doctor." Her tone was not admiring. Celeste extended her hand. Margot didn't take it. Ethan noticed. "Dr. Monroe saved my life," he said, his voice like steel beneath velvet. Margot raised a brow. "Did she, or has she merely prolonged your recovery? You always did prefer unconventional paths." Celeste took a small step back, folding her hands behind her. She had been in rooms with CEOs, patients dying of rare cancers, and angry, grieving families. But somehow Margot's gaze made her feel more dissected than any scalpel ever could. They sat in the sunken living room, the tension thick as snow clouds. Ethan watched his mother, carefully noting the flick of her wrist as she sipped her espresso, the way her fingers drummed against the rim of the saucer. Margot didn't come often, only when summoned, and never without an agenda. "I've spoken with Aurelius," she said smoothly. "The board is concerned. Your prolonged absence, the delay in quarterly reporting, people are beginning to ask questions." "I'm recovering." "You're hiding." Celeste, seated off to the side, tensed. Ethan's voice stayed level. "I'm healing. There's a difference." Margot's eyes narrowed. "And is this," she gestured vaguely toward Celeste, "part of the therapy playing house, with a physician who's far too involved?" "That's enough." He said it calmly, but the air shifted. Celeste stood. "I'll give you both some privacy." "No," Ethan said, sharper than intended, then softer. "Please stay." Margot pursed her lips. "So this is serious?" "No," Celeste said quickly before Ethan could speak. "This is professional." Margot smiled without warmth. "Of course it is." The room fell into silence. A kind of standoff, built not on words but glances sharp enough to wound. Then Margot stood. "Ethan, darling, you've always confused distance with strength, but from where I'm standing, you look alarmingly weak." She walked to the door, then paused. "Be careful, my son. People like her only stay while there's something to fix." The door shut with a crisp finality. Celeste stood frozen, pulse roaring in her ears. Ethan stared at the floor, hands clenched in his lap. "She's wrong," he said quietly. Celeste's voice wavered. "Is she?" He looked up. "You want to leave?" "I don't know what I want right now." He nodded slowly. "I never asked you to stay for me." "I know. But I've never asked anyone to stay, Celeste. Not in my entire life." The room felt suddenly too large, too fragile. The words between them too loud. "You've built this fortress," she said softly. "And I walked in without asking. Maybe I should have knocked." "You didn't need to," he said. "I opened the door." A long pause. Then Celeste moved closer, kneeling beside him, her hand hovering over his. "I'm not here because you're broken," she whispered. "I'm here because I see the man behind the bruises, and he's not as alone as he thinks." Ethan's fingers brushed hers, and just like that, something softened again. A crack in the wall, a glimmer of light. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch beyond that slight brush of skin. But in that small act, fingers barely entwined, they made a choice. Not to rush, not to run, but to remain. Even with the ghosts, even with the judgments, even with the storm outside. The morning after Margot Prescott's visit, the walls of the penthouse seemed to hum with a quieter tension, less like an argument left unresolved, and more like the stillness before a storm you couldn't yet name. Dr. Celeste Monroe moved through the space with her usual poise, reviewing lab results on her tablet, but her shoulders were straighter than usual, her eyes more watchful. Something about Margot's words had stayed with her, burrowed beneath her professionalism, like a thorn beneath skin. People like her only stay while there's something to fix. Ethan hadn't spoken of it again, but he didn't need to. That afternoon, Celeste found him in his study, a room she rarely entered. It was a stark space of black walnut shelves, glass walls, and a single abstract painting that looked like someone had slashed through midnight with a blade. Ethan sat behind the desk in a tailored charcoal button-down, one leg propped on a leather ottoman, his laptop open and eyes unreadable. "Am I interrupting?" she asked gently. His fingers paused above the keys. "Never." She walked in slowly, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles paled slightly as he gripped the mouse. "Is something wrong?" Ethan didn't look up. "The board's pushing an emergency vote. They're threatening to override my executive authority unless I return to the office within the next week." Celeste frowned. "But your neurologist hasn't cleared you to fly yet." "I know." "Then why?" "Because they smell blood," Ethan said flatly. "They think I'm weak. They think the accident softened me. They think you—" He stopped himself. Celeste's voice cooled. "They think I'm compromising your judgment." He finally looked up. "It doesn't matter what's true. It matters what they can weaponize." Later that day, an email landed in Celeste's inbox from the hospital's administrative board. She read it 3 times, her pulse rising with each word. A formal inquiry had been opened into her conduct, alleging ethical misconduct and a breach of professional boundaries. The letter cited anonymous concerns regarding her personal proximity to a high-profile patient, blurred lines between medical service and private companionship, and potential conflicts of interest jeopardizing clinical objectivity. She stared at the screen, unable to move. It wasn't just slander. It was a calculated strike. And she knew exactly who had orchestrated it. Celeste found Ethan on the penthouse terrace, bundled in a soft navy coat, a blanket draped across his knees. The skyline stretched endlessly behind him, but his eyes didn't move from the horizon. "You knew," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "I suspected." "You should have told me." "I thought I could contain it." Celeste stepped closer. "They're coming after me to get to you." "Why?" Ethan finally turned, and the look in his eyes was unlike anything she had seen in him before. No longer the detached billionaire or the broken patient, but a man stripped of illusion, raw and furious. "Because when power fails to control people," he said, "it begins to destroy them." She swallowed. "Your mother. She still holds controlling interest in one of our subsidiary branches. She's using it to mobilize the board. And she knows I won't play their game without limits anymore." Celeste took a breath, trying to steady herself. "What are we going to do?" He reached out, taking her hand. "We're not doing anything. I am going to fix this." She shook her head. "This isn't just your fight now." His voice turned quiet. "I never wanted to pull you into this world. The vultures, the masks, the cameras, the part of power that rots from the inside." Celeste knelt beside his chair, their faces level. "I don't care about the cameras. I care about the man who looked me in the eye the night we met and asked me if I believed in healing." His throat worked. "I don't want to lose you." "Then don't hide from me." They stayed like that for a long moment, hand in hand, forehead to forehead, until the wind carried the first flakes of snow across the terrace. But the damage had already begun. The press broke the story within 24 hours. Prescott's private physician or lover ethical lines blurred in Beacon Hill. A grainy photograph surfaced, Celeste helping Ethan from his wheelchair. Their heads bowed close, his hand on her arm. The headlines didn't ask questions. They drew conclusions. The hospital placed Celeste on administrative leave pending review. Reporters camped outside the penthouse, their cameras flashing like gunfire at every shadow behind the curtain. Inside, Ethan paced the study in frustration, phone to his ear barking orders to legal and public relations. Celeste sat on the sofa in the dark, hands clasped in her lap, staring blankly at the wall. "This is my fault," Ethan said after the third press call ended. "No," she replied. "It's their game. We just became pawns. I should have seen it coming." "You did. You just hoped love might protect us." He paused. "Is that what this is?" She turned her face toward him. "Yes," she whispered. "That's what makes it so dangerous." That night, Celeste didn't sleep in the guest room. She didn't even make it down the hallway. Instead, she sat with Ethan by the fireplace until the flames faded to embers, her head resting on his shoulder, their hands linked between them like a quiet rebellion. They didn't speak of strategies. They didn't speak of consequences. They spoke of truth, the kind that no board vote could erase. "I'll fight for you," Ethan said, voice low in the dim light. "And I'll stand beside you," Celeste answered. "But promise me one thing. Anything. When this is over, don't let them make you cold again." He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I won't. Not as long as you're still holding my hand." And so they sat, two people lit by a dying fire, surrounded by shadows, but refusing, despite everything, to let go. The courtroom was colder than expected. Even in early spring, marble walls and polished floors trapped the chill. And Ethan Prescott stood at the defense table, as if carved from the same stone, silent, unmoving, but pulsing with quiet intensity beneath his charcoal suit. This wasn't a criminal trial. It was a corporate arbitration. But anyone who understood power knew these were the real battles where reputations died, shares shifted, and empires unraveled, not with bullets, but with signatures. Across the aisle, his mother sat at the opposing table. Margot Prescott, the Queen Regent of a crumbling dynasty, poised in a cream suit, a single sapphire pinned to her lapel like a badge of ruthlessness. She didn't look at her son, but she didn't need to. Her silence was loud enough. The board had brought the motion to remove Ethan from the CEO seat, citing prolonged absence, emotional instability, and breach of fiduciary integrity. But beneath all the polished legalese, the truth was simpler: he had chosen to be human, and they could not forgive him for that. 2 days earlier, Ethan had sat across from Celeste Monroe, not in bed or on the terrace or at the dinner table, but in the sterile quiet of her now vacated clinic. She had handed over her badge, her stethoscope, her last official tie to the hospital that had once trusted her. "They're going to make an example of me," she'd said softly. "Even if the investigation proves I didn't breach protocol, the damage is done." Ethan had wanted to promise her revenge redemption, to storm the gates of every institution that had turned its back on her. But instead, he had reached across the desk and taken her hand. "Then let me give them a better example." She had blinked, unsure. "What do you mean?" "I've spent my entire life letting other people write the story of who I'm supposed to be," he said. "And I'm done letting the ending be dictated by fear." She searched his face. "Are you sure?" "For the first time in my life." Now in the courtroom, Ethan stepped forward. His lawyer began to speak, reading carefully curated statements of competence and recovery. But then Ethan raised a hand. "May I address the board directly?" There was hesitation, then a nod. He faced the semicircle of men and women who had once called him a prodigy and now labeled him a liability. "When I was 19, Ethan began, I became the youngest CTO of a publicly traded AI firm. By 25, I had built a billion-dollar empire, negotiated acquisitions, and watched my own face become a brand." He paused. "But what I hadn't done was live." A murmur stirred through the room, but he continued. "I knew how to read a market trend, manipulate media, secure investors. But I didn't know how to touch someone without flinching. I didn't know what it meant to let another person see me, not the curated version. Me." He looked toward the gallery where Celeste sat in the back row, wearing no makeup, her curls loose, eyes locked on his. "I was in a car accident," he said, "that could have killed me. But it didn't, because someone chose to sit beside me in the darkness and refuse to leave. That person, Dr. Celeste Monroe, didn't just heal my body, she woke my soul." A hushed silence fell. "I will not apologize for caring," Ethan said, voice tightening. "I will not apologize for choosing kindness over convenience. And I will not allow this board or my own mother to weaponize compassion as weakness." His gaze finally landed on Margot. "For years, I believed strength meant control. I inherited that from you. But now I see real strength is choosing truth when it's messy. Real strength is loving someone openly, even when the world calls it reckless." Margot's face didn't change, but her fingers folded neatly in her lap, curled slightly. "I am willing to walk away from this company," Ethan said clearly. "But if I do, I walk out whole, as a man who finally chose the life he wants, not the one designed for him." And with that, he stepped back. The board deliberated for 35 minutes. Enough time for a life to turn over, break, and breathe again. When the doors reopened, the chairman cleared his throat. The board votes to retain Mr. Prescott as acting CEO with limited advisory restrictions and immediate reinstatement of executive privileges. Gas, whispers. Margot rose, already gathering her coat. She walked past Ethan without a word, but not before pausing for half a second. "I see now," she murmured under her breath. "You really are your father's son." It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't quite contempt either. And then she was gone. Outside the courthouse, the sky opened up, bright, blinding sunlight streaking across the cobblestones like absolution. Reporters swarmed, cameras clicked, but Ethan only saw one face in the crowd: Celeste. She moved toward him as if in a dream, unhurried, eyes shimmering. "I didn't know what you were going to say in there," she whispered. "Neither did I," he replied. And then he reached for her, not cautiously, not with apology, but with the clarity of a man who had burned the mask and stepped out into himself. Their kiss wasn't the desperate thing it had been in stolen moments before. It was calm, certain, earned. Later that night, they stood on the rooftop terrace, Boston's skyline glowing around them like a necklace of stars. Celeste leaned into him. "Do you regret choosing me?" Ethan wrapped his arms around her. "No, I regret waiting so long to start living." And beneath that infinite stretch of sky, the man who once feared vulnerability now held it like a crown. He had chosen her, and at last himself. It was a Tuesday when the word fell like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Celeste had gone in for a routine checkup, nothing unusual, just a precautionary blood panel, something she'd done 100 times for others. She hadn't expected anything more than a friendly nod from the technician and a reminder to hydrate. But that evening her phone rang, and within 10 minutes her world folded in on itself. The diagnosis was early-stage lymphoma, caught by accident, silent, sneaky, and tucked in the hollows of her lymph nodes like a sleeping thief. The irony didn't escape her. After all her years of healing others, she had somehow missed the quiet warning signs in herself. She sat in her apartment, lights dimmed, staring at the paper in her hand. The ink blurred around the words biopsy, chemotherapy, monitoring. Her fingers trembled, but her breath stayed even. The strength that had carried her through midnight ER calls and grieving families now simply held her upright. But inside, the quiet began to crack. Ethan found her there an hour later. He didn't knock. He had a key. "Celeste," his voice was gentle, unsure. She didn't answer. He stepped into the living room and stopped when he saw her. She was curled on the couch in a gray sweatshirt and soft leggings, a cup of untouched tea on the table beside her. His eyes landed on the papers. She saw the moment he understood. She didn't speak, and he didn't ask. He simply walked over, sat down beside her, and pulled her into his arms. For the first time in years, Dr. Celeste Monroe let someone else carry the silence. The next week was a blur of appointments, consultations, and second opinions. Celeste approached her own diagnosis the way she would a patient's methodical, informed calm. But something in her had shifted. She spoke less, smiled only when she had to, and every night after she fell asleep on Ethan's chest, he would stare at the ceiling, counting every heartbeat like a prayer. Then one morning she found him standing in the middle of her kitchen, holding something small in his hand. A box. She blinked. "Is that what I think it is?" He didn't answer right away. He looked terrified, not of rejection, but of time. "I was going to wait," he said, "for the right moment. A dinner, a trip, something perfect." She raised an eyebrow. "But then I realized," he went on, "there's no such thing as the right moment when the heart's already chosen. There's only now, and now is everything." Celeste stared at him, tears burning behind her eyes. "I don't want to marry you because I'm afraid," he said. "I want to marry you because you've given me a reason to believe in forever, even if forever turns out to be shorter than we plan." She didn't let him kneel. She walked into his arms, pressed her forehead against his, and whispered, "Yes." The wedding was planned in under 2 weeks. No extravagant venues, no headline spreads. Just a private garden tucked behind a historic chapel in Martha's Vineyard, where lilacs had begun to bloom in the gentle April chill. Celeste wore a simple ivory dress with off-the-shoulder sleeves and a crown of baby's breath in her curls. Ethan wore a dark blue suit and a smile that hadn't left his face since she said yes. There were no bridesmaids, no groomsmen, just a circle of those who mattered most, her aunt from Baltimore, his best friend from grad school, a few nurses from her former ward, and one solemn-faced oncologist who held her hand before the ceremony and whispered, "We're going to beat this. Together." When Celeste walked down the path, Ethan couldn't breathe. Not because of fear, but because of clarity. Every step she took was a declaration not of illness, but of strength. Not of fragility, but of presence. This was not a wedding of desperation. It was a wedding of defiance. They stood beneath an old oak tree, its branches woven with white silk and strands of lavender. The officiant spoke softly. Vows were exchanged not with trembling voices, but with unshakable conviction. Ethan's hands trembled only once when he brushed a tear from Celeste's cheek and said, "I vow to hold you in all your tomorrows, even the ones that hurt." Celeste took a breath and answered, "And I vow to let you in even when I'm afraid, especially then." The kiss was quiet, but in it was the thunder of everything they had survived. That night the world stood still. They returned to Boston as husband and wife, the ring on Celeste's finger, warm from his palm, the paperwork filed, the names signed. There were no headlines, no scandals, just two people curled beneath linen sheets, fingers entwined with a bottle of ginger ale between them, and jazz playing softly in the background. Celeste whispered in the dark, "I'm scared." Ethan tightened his arm around her. "Me too." And then, "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He kissed her temple. "Then we're right where we're supposed to be." Outside, the city glittered like it always had. But inside that room, something new had been born. Not just a marriage, not even just hope, but the courage to live fully even when the future comes wrapped in shadows. Because when love is chosen in spite of the fear, it becomes a light strong enough to carry them through anything. The sun rose pale over Boston Harbor, its light filtered through gauze-gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves were uncertain how much warmth to offer. Celeste stood at the window of their penthouse, her fingertips pressed gently to the cool glass, watching boats drift in the distance like dreams half remembered. Her wedding ring glinted faintly on her hand, catching the morning light. But today she felt none of the ceremony's magic, because today their love was going on trial, not in a court of law, at least not technically, but in the cold chambers of the Massachusetts Medical Board, where ethics were reviewed in fluorescent lighting and humanity was often lost in paperwork. She had received the notice just days after their quiet sacred wedding, a formal hearing to determine whether her license should be suspended or revoked, stemming from the accusations Margot had strategically launched weeks earlier. Conflict of interest, the document had stated. Improper relationship with a high-profile patient. The charges read more like a scandalous tabloid headline than a reflection of the truth. Ethan had offered to handle it, to call in lawyers, spin doctors, even board members who owed him favors. But Celeste had refused. "This is my name," she had said. "My fight. I'll walk into that room on my own." And so she had. The hearing room smelled of antiseptic and old paper. A panel of 5 administrators sat behind a long table. 4 men, 1 woman, all dressed in neutral tones and armed with legal pads. Their expressions were unreadable. Celeste sat across from them in a navy suit, her natural curls pinned back makeup, minimal eyes clear. The lead investigator adjusted his glasses. "Dr. Monroe, we're here to assess your conduct during your time treating Mr. Ethan Prescott. The question before us is not about personal feeling, but professional judgment." Celeste nodded. "I understand. We have testimony suggesting that you formed an inappropriate emotional attachment during the course of treatment." Her voice was steady. "May I clarify something before we continue?" "Of course." She folded her hands. "This isn't just about ethics. It's about perception, about who gets to define what professionalism looks like in the face of human connection." A ripple of unease crossed one of the board members' faces. "I didn't set out to fall in love with Ethan," she continued. "When I arrived at his penthouse that first night, I was exhausted, skeptical, and more than a little jaded. He was broken, bitter, and fighting the ghosts of every betrayal he'd endured." She drew in a breath. "We didn't see each other clearly at first. I saw a patient. He saw a problem. but day by day, wall by wall, that changed. The woman on the panel leaned forward. Dr. Monroe, the issue is not your personal journey. It's whether your actions crossed a boundary that compromised your role as a physician. Celeste didn't flinch. I terminated my role as his attending once our relationship evolved. Every decision I made before that was documented, approved, and in line with hospital protocol. And yet you married him. Yes, Celeste said softly. Because I love him. Not because I needed to fix him. Not because he saved my career. But because despite the firestorm around us, we found something worth protecting. Another board member, older, leaned back and tented his fingers. You do realize that some may view this as romanticizing what could be seen as an exploitation of power dynamics. Celeste's spine straightened. With respect, I didn't have the power in that dynamic. He was the billionaire. The media, darling. I was a woman of color in a system that rarely favors either. The room went still. I was the one who stood to lose everything. And I did my position, my hospital privileges, my reputation. But I stayed because the truth is simple. Ethan never asked me to give up who I am. He asked me to believe that I could be loved exactly as I am. A hush fell over the room. For a long time, no one spoke. Outside, Ethan waited in the hallway. He paced like a man who had conquered corporate boardrooms, but now felt helpless. He hated this feeling, this watching from the sidelines, this knowing that the woman he loved was fighting for her name because of him. When the door opened, Celeste stepped out, pale but composed. He moved to her instantly. How did it go? They'll send the ruling in 2 days, she said quietly. He reached for her hand. Whatever happens. I know, she murmured. I already have everything that matters. But her eyes for a moment betrayed the weight of the war she carried. The ruling arrived on a Friday. It came by email, short, clinical, and devastating. License suspended. Review in 6 months. Celeste stared at the screen, then closed her laptop, then walked out onto the balcony and breathed. Ethan found her there minutes later, wrapped in a sweater too thin for the breeze. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice catching. I'm not, she whispered. He turned to her. I fought for us, she said, with everything I had, and I'd do it again. He cupped her face in his hands. I hate that this happened. I don't, she said, surprising them both. Because it means I chose love, not safety, not rules, not reputation, love. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Ethan kissed her gently, reverently, like she was both the war and the peace after. That night, they danced in the kitchen. No music, no lights, just moonlight spilling through the windows and the soft sound of rain against glass. Celeste hummed an old jazz melody under her breath, and Ethan followed her lead, hands at her waist, forehead, resting against hers. You think they'll ever forgive us, he asked. Celeste smiled. Maybe, but we didn't do this to be forgiven. Then why? She looked up into his eyes. To be free. And in that quiet dance beneath the echoes of the world's judgment, 2 hearts held each other steady. Love had been put on trial, and though the verdict wasn't in their favor, the truth was, they had already won. The ring was simple, an emerald-cut diamond nestled into a slim platinum band. Ethan had chosen it himself long before he understood what love required. At the time, it had seemed like enough, elegant, precise, expensive. Everything he'd been taught to value. But as he watched Celeste in the pale morning light, barefoot in their kitchen, hair undone, reading a medical journal with a quiet concentration that made the world feel suspended, he understood that the ring had never been the point. It was the woman who wore it, and the fire she ignited simply by staying. A week after the verdict, the resistance began to take form, not through lawyers or protests, but through smaller, more defiant acts of grace. Celeste had retreated to the margins of her career, barred temporarily from practicing, but she had not stopped healing. She began offering free consultations at a community wellness center in Roxbury, focusing on underserved patients, many of whom didn't trust traditional medical institutions to begin with. Her reputation, bruised by headlines, did not follow her there. Only her name, only her heart. Ethan went with her, once quietly dressed in jeans and a soft gray hoodie. No one recognized him. No one cared. He watched her kneel beside a child with asthma, listened as she explained inhaler usage to a single mother in Spanish, and felt something inside him expand, something that didn't concern revenue or reputation, but purpose. On the ride home, he asked, "How do you keep doing this after everything?" Celeste smiled faintly, because the people who need help the most are rarely the ones writing the rules. He didn't reply, but that night he sent a seven-figure donation to the wellness center, anonymously. But not everyone had forgotten. In the gleaming towers of Beacon Hill, Margot Prescott watched her son's choices unfold with the sharp, practiced scrutiny of a woman who had once built her empire on controlling men weaker than herself. The marriage had embarrassed her. The medical scandal had given her ammunition. But the real danger was something deeper. Ethan was no longer obeying the script. He had pulled away from their family foundation, redistributed control of key holdings, and most threatening of all, he had started liquidating assets to fund Celeste's quiet revolution. "He's going rogue," her attorney had said. "He's falling," Margot replied coldly, "but not fast enough." And so the second wave began, not in courtrooms, but in contracts, anonymous audits, surprise reviews of his companies, whispers seeded into press outlets about instability, erratic decisions, even rumors of divorce. Celeste read one of the headlines while sipping coffee one morning. "Whispers from the penthouse has the fairy tale already cracked." She quoted, eyes narrowing. Ethan set down his mug. "They're trying to rattle us." She folded the page and slid it aside. "Then let's not shake." But even as they steeled themselves, the world continued to press in. A week later, Ethan was summoned to an emergency shareholder meeting. A hostile takeover was being whispered, framed as a concern for stability, orchestrated by an international tech consortium, and quietly backed, he was sure, by Margot. He paced the marble lobby of the office tower, suit perfectly pressed, but his nerves strung tight like piano wire. When Celeste arrived uninvited but not unwelcome, he stared at her in surprise. "I thought you were meeting with the foundation in Dorchester." "I was," she said, "but I had a feeling you'd need reminding." "Of what?" She took his hand, curled her fingers through his. "That no matter what they say in there, you already won the only vote that matters." He smiled softly. "You're getting good at speeches. I'm married to you. It's contagious." He pulled her close, forehead touching hers. "Come with me." "To the meeting?" "To all of it." And so she did. Inside the boardroom, Ethan faced his shareholders, not as a CEO performing a script, but as a man unwilling to be reshaped. He spoke of innovation, of resilience, of a new model of leadership that valued humanity as much as profit. Some called it naive, others revolutionary. But most of all, he spoke of truth. "I didn't fall apart," he said. "I chose to rebuild differently." The vote was close, but it passed. He remained in power, by a margin of 3. That night back at home, Celeste found a new box on her pillow, smaller than the first, velvet black, no fanfare. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a second ring. Same cut, same metal. But this one wasn't diamond. It was carved from polished onyx, dark, strong, and grounding. "For when the world gets loud," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "A reminder of what we are beneath the noise." She held it between her fingers, then slid it onto her right hand. It fit perfectly. "2 rings?" she asked with a smile. He shrugged. "For the woman who's given me 2 lives." And just like that, the storm outside faded to silence. They lay together in bed that night, arms tangled, breath steady. "Do you ever wonder," Celeste whispered, "what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances?" Ethan pressed his lips to her shoulder. "No," he said, "because we didn't fall in love despite the chaos. We found each other inside it." And in the hush that followed, she felt it, the ring cool against her skin and the pulse of his heart beneath her fingertips. Love, they were learning, was not forged in perfection. It was forged in resistance. And it gleamed brighter for it. There you. It was late October when the sky began to soften into that pale New England gray, where trees shed their gold and the world seemed to exhale. Ethan and Celeste had escaped the city for a weekend, just the two of them in a cedar cabin tucked into the edge of Vermont's forests, with a wood-burning stove, quilted blankets, and the quiet that only comes when no one needs to be anyone but who they are. The fire crackled gently. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with the hush of whispered secrets. Celeste sat curled on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, a mug of cinnamon tea in her hands. Her hair, loose and wild, fell in soft curls against her cheek. Ethan emerged from the bedroom with an armful of logs and a lopsided grin. You know, if I had known chopping wood would make you look at me like that, I would have skipped Wall Street entirely. Celeste laughed softly, the sound light but distant, as though her heart was elsewhere. He noticed. He always did now. Talk to me, he said, setting the logs aside. She hesitated, then placed her tea down with careful precision. Her fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of her sweater, pulling the yarn around her knuckles. I miss my cycle, she said softly. Ethan blinked. You're... She looked up, meeting his gaze. I took a test. 2, actually. And then, like a slow sunrise pushing over the mountains, her lips formed a word she wasn't sure she believed yet. Positive. He didn't speak at first, not out of fear, but awe. His mind tried to string together phrases. Are you sure? Are you okay? What does this mean with your treatment? But all that came out was a shaky breath and a half laugh, half sob. Celeste reached for his hand. I know this isn't what we planned, especially now. He dropped to his knees in front of her forehead, resting on her belly like he was listening for music inside the silence. You, he whispered, voice rough with emotion. You're carrying life. I'm carrying our life. Tears slipped down his cheek unchecked. This man, once too cold to touch, too cautious to feel, was weeping in the arms of a woman who had taught him to live. They drove back to Boston the next morning in silence, both suspended in a kind of reverent stillness, like a breath being held across miles. Back in the city, tests were scheduled, appointments made. Celeste sat in the sterile office of her oncologist listening as the doctor spoke carefully, tenderly, about the complexities of managing her condition while carrying a child. It won't be easy, the doctor said. We'll have to monitor closely. There are risks, but it's not impossible. Celeste nodded. I've never done anything the easy way. Ethan squeezed her hand, his grip steady, even as his mind reeled with what-ifs. They had braved scandal, rejection, judgment, and now they would brave biology itself. The first ultrasound came on a rainy Thursday. Celeste lay on the table, eyes fixed on the monitor, her fingers ice cold despite Ethan's warmth beside her. Then there it was, a flicker, tiny, fierce, unapologetically alive. The sonographer smiled. That's your baby's heartbeat. Celeste didn't breathe. Ethan did. A deep, trembling inhale like someone surfacing after years underwater. That sound, he murmured. It's not alone, the technician added gently, turning the probe slightly. Another flicker. Another heartbeat. Time stilled. Ethan leaned forward. Wait. 2? Celeste blinked, dazed. Twins. The sonographer grinned. 2 strong heartbeats. Congratulations. Later that night, they sat on the floor of their bedroom, surrounded by unopened mail and a half-eaten container of Thai food, the news still echoing in the walls of their quiet home. 2 heartbeats. 2 futures. 2 tiny revolutions growing inside a woman the world had tried to silence. I'm scared, Celeste whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to the curve of her shoulder. So am I. She turned to face him. But I want this, she said. I want them, even if it's hard. Even if I lose more sleep than I ever thought possible. He cupped her face gently. You've already given me everything. You still want more, she teased through tears. I want the chaos, the sleepless nights, the Lego injuries, the finger painting on the walls, the dance recitals, the science fairs, all of it. She melted into him, laughter tangled with sorrow and wonder and fierce, fierce love. In the weeks that followed, the world softened toward them. The medical board quietly updated her case file, noting extraordinary circumstances and reevaluating the terms of her suspension. Donations to the wellness center increased. Paparazzi sightings faded as new scandals surfaced elsewhere. And in the middle of it all, Celeste began to glow. Not with the porcelain glow of celebrity pregnancy, but something deeper. A kind of radiance that came from having chosen every difficult thing and surviving it. One morning, Ethan brought home a bassinet handcrafted by a local artisan, painted seafoam green. Celeste ran her fingers over the smooth wood and smiled. 2 heartbeats, she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and won home. That night, she felt the first flutter. Not the thump of a heartbeat this time, but the whisper of life pushing outward as if to say, we're here. She laid Ethan's hand over her belly. Feel that? He nodded, eyes wide, reverent. She rested her head against his chest where his own heartbeat, older, steadier, answered in rhythm. And in that room beneath a quilt of quiet joy and fragile hope, 4 heartbeats moved as one. A symphony of second chances, a song written in defiance of fear, and the beginning of a love that would never ever be small again. Sarita Warren. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and lemon-scented disinfectant, a scent that once comforted Celeste, a woman trained to draw calm from the sterile. But this time, as she lay in bed with wires trailing from her wrists and machines mapping her rhythms in glowing green pulses, it felt more like a battleground than sanctuary. She was 30 weeks pregnant and bleeding. It started with a dull ache at dawn, low and insistent, then a gush of crimson soaking through her robe as she stood brushing her teeth. The ambulance had come in 5 minutes. Ethan's voice had barely held together as he rode beside her, his hand clamped around hers like he could hold her body together through sheer force of will. Now, hours later, the pain had dulled, but the fear had sharpened. She was calm, or at least she appeared to be. Years in the ER had trained her to prioritize breath over panic, but beneath her cool exterior, her mind raced, not the babies. Please, not the babies. A young obstetrician entered, her smile soft, but her posture tense. The bleeding stabilized, she said, but we need to keep you under observation. The next few days are critical. Ethan stood at the window, arms folded, shoulders rigid. Will they be okay? He asked, voice tight. The doctor hesitated. They're strong, but premature delivery is a possibility. We'll do everything we can. Celeste nodded slowly, already calculating magnesium dosages and NICU probabilities in her mind. But her heart had never felt so vulnerable. Ethan barely left her side. He camped out in the recliner by her bed, unshaven and exhausted, holding her hand through the beeps and silences. One night she woke to find him speaking softly to her belly, his voice low and steady. Hey, little warriors, he whispered. It's your dad. I don't know much about lullabies, but I promise you this, if you hang on just a little longer, I will spend the rest of my life making this world worthy of you. Celeste lay still, eyes closed, tears slipping silently down her cheek. But while they fought their private battle in the hospital, the fire was burning elsewhere. It started with a leak, an anonymous blog post written in icy prose and filled with confidential medical information detailing Celeste's diagnosis, her pregnancy, and an unsubstantiated claim that she'd hidden her condition from the hospital during her final months on staff. The post went viral in hours. By afternoon, news anchors were speculating whether Ethan Prescott had bought his wife's silence, whether the children were being used as a distraction, whether a scandal was brewing bigger than anyone had expected. Ethan's phone buzzed nonstop, but he didn't leave the hospital. Not even when his board called an emergency meeting. Not even when his mother's attorney left 3 voicemails. Not even when a security breach was reported at one of his subsidiaries. He stayed with Celeste. You should go, she whispered, once eyes heavy with sedation. No, he said, not this time. She smiled faintly. You finally picked a side. I didn't pick, he said. I became one. That night, as the city sizzled with scandal and headlines, Ethan turned inward. With a laptop balanced on his knees and a heart burning with fury, he drafted a letter. It wasn't just a press release. It was a reckoning. In it, he named the truth. Every line pulsed with clarity. About Celeste's diagnosis, about their choice to love through fire, about the line between public curiosity and personal cruelty. He addressed it not to his shareholders, nor to the media, but to the world. And then he published it under his name with no edits, no legal filter, and no apology. By dawn, it had been read over 3 million times. The comments began to shift. People spoke of resilience, of empathy, of the sacredness of choosing love over convenience. Strangers left flowers outside the hospital. Letters poured in. Former patients of Celeste's wrote tributes of her quiet brilliance and unshakable kindness. And the fire that had once threatened to burn them down was now lighting the path forward. On the 5th day of hospitalization, Celeste's condition stabilized. The bleeding had stopped. The twins remained safely cocooned, their heartbeats steady and strong. The medical team smiled with cautious optimism, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale. Ethan helped her sit up slowly, tucking pillows behind her back. Outside the window, the first flakes of snow drifted over Boston, soft and weightless. She turned her face toward him, weary but radiant. "Do you think we've made it out of the storm?" she asked. He took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and held her gaze. "We didn't just survive it," he whispered. "We built our home in it." Weeks later, as she lay in bed, larger now, stronger, her laughter returning in quiet moments, Ethan reached for a thin, leather-bound notebook. Inside were pages of ideas he'd been writing during their long nights at the hospital. "You've been journaling," she teased. He shook his head. "Building something." She flipped through sketches, names, and mission statements. At the center, the Monroe Foundation, a new initiative dedicated to providing maternal care and cancer resources to underserved women. Her eyes widened. "You built this?" He smiled. "We did." She rested her hand on her belly where two lives stirred beneath the surface. "Out of the fire," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Into something that matters." In a world that had tried to break them through whispers, judgments, and shadows, Celeste and Ethan had chosen to rise, not untouched, but transformed. Together they had learned what it meant to burn, and what it meant to build. So win. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, gently then, all at once. In Boston, cherry blossoms unfurled along the Charles River, and the wind lost its bite. Morning light filtered through linen curtains, spilling across the wooden floors of the Prescott's newly renovated townhouse in the South End. The home, once stark and monochrome, now bloomed with soft hues, lullabies, and the quiet magic of new life. It was there on an ordinary Tuesday in early May that everything changed forever. Celeste woke just after dawn, her body aching with an ancient knowing. It was time. The labor was long. Hours passed in waves, pain, breath, pain again. But Celeste was steel-wrapped in velvet, and Ethan never once let go of her hand. In a room filled with monitors and masked professionals, their eyes stayed locked as though tethered by something older than this lifetime. She screamed once, cried out twice, but never asked for relief. And then, after what felt like the unraveling of time itself, the room filled with sound. Not one but two cries, tiny, defiant, unforgettable. Twins, a boy and a girl. Ethan fell to his knees the moment he saw them. Not from weakness, but reverence. Like a man at the foot of something holy. Celeste, flushed and glowing with exhaustion, held both babies against her chest, their hearts drumming against hers in perfect harmony. Two heartbeats. Now voices. Now names. They named the boy August Elias for the month they first met and the strength of his lineage. They named the girl Nova Grace for the stars that had guided them when all else was shadow. At home, the nursery had been painted soft sage and ivory. Books lined the shelves, some science, some fairy tales. A rocking chair waited beside the window, next to a mobile that played a jazz lullaby Celeste's father used to hum. The twins slept in tandem, curled like commas in the chapters of their parents' healing. Life didn't return to normal. It became something better. Celeste's license was officially reinstated by summer, though she returned to medicine, slowly choosing a hybrid path, one that allowed her to serve without sacrificing presence. She volunteered at the Monroe Foundation twice a week, offered virtual consultations to mothers with complex diagnoses, and wrote essays about what it meant to live fully inside the uncertainty of womanhood. Ethan, once consumed by numbers and quarterly returns, stepped down as CEO. He remained on the board but turned his gaze toward impact. He became a full-time father, a part-time angel investor in maternal tech, and an occasional writer of children's books, inspired by two wobbly coos and a pair of gummy smiles. Together, they built a rhythm. Mornings began with lullabies and warm bottles, followed by stroller walks through the commons. Afternoons meant naps, sometimes for the babies, sometimes for Ethan on the nursery floor, one twin curled against his chest. Evenings brought baths, stories, and whispered blessings, spoken in two voices that had once been so different and now sang the same lullaby in two harmonies. One evening in late summer, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood on the porch with August on his hip. The baby had just learned to laugh, a breathless, hiccuping sound that stopped Ethan's heart every time it escaped his son's mouth. Celeste appeared in the doorway, Nova pressed to her chest, her curls still damp from a bath. They both went down without a fuss, she said, wonder in her voice. Ethan smiled, a miracle. She stepped beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Do you ever think about the version of us that might have been? She asked if life had gone differently. He looked at her. I think about the version of me before you. She turned. And I don't miss him. They hosted a quiet gathering that fall. Just a few close friends, some colleagues from the wellness center, a couple of journalists who had once written them off now writing again with curiosity, not condemnation. The living room was filled with food laughter and the soft sounds of baby giggles. August grabbed a guest's glasses and chewed on them triumphantly. Nova took her first steps, two quick, unsteady paces, before collapsing into her mother's arms. In that moment, no one remembered headlines, or scandal, or the fire they had once walked through. Only love. Only the family they had built. Later that night, after the last guest had gone, and the twins were asleep, Ethan and Celeste sat in the kitchen, barefoot, sharing the last slice of peach pie. I used to think happiness was a finish line, Ethan said, licking a crumb from his thumb. Someplace you ran toward, hoping you deserve it once you got there. Celeste leaned her chin on her hand. And now? He looked at her, really looked. It's this, he said. Sticky counters, sleepy eyes, a wife who still leaves her coffee mug everywhere, a daughter who thinks the floor is lava, a son who believes my shoulder is the safest place on earth. Her eyes shimmered. You forgot the part where your wife smells like spit up and still hasn't finished a sentence without yawning. He grinned, especially that part. They laughed quietly, their hands meeting in the middle of the table. And for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't trying to outrun anything. They were already home. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, just as they had on that first night. Ethan saw her in the hospital corridor, worn radiant, unshakably real. Inside, two heartbeats dreamed side by side. And upstairs in the room, painted in sage and promise, the world was remade in every rise and fall of two tiny chests. The family they built wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. It was theirs. And it was more than enough. Seaborn one. It was a quiet morning in late spring, one of those days so still and golden, it felt like time had paused to listen. Ethan stood in the backyard, barefoot in the grass, still wet with dew, watching as Nova toddled after a butterfly, and August tried to balance a pine cone on top of a wooden truck. Their laughter rang out across the garden like wind chimes. Celeste stepped out from the kitchen door, coffee in one hand, the other resting on the curve of her hip, where their third child now stirred gently beneath her skin. She had that unmistakable glow again, not just from the pregnancy, but from living a life she had chosen, fought for, and reclaimed inch by inch. Their eyes met. It was the kind of glance that held decades in a second. He smiled, she smiled back. No words were needed. A year ago, they had stood on the edge of ruin. False headlines, medical scares, family betrayals, and fear had tried to crush them. But love, messy, wounded, stubborn love had been the constant. Not a fairy tale kind of love, but a real one forged in silence, refined in conflict, and sealed with forgiveness. Now everything around them felt like proof of that triumph. The townhouse they had once walked into as strangers was now full of fingerprints, scribbled crayon murals on the wall, scattered toys and framed moments that told a different story, one written by two hearts that had dared to begin again. That evening, they took a drive up the coast. Celeste's head rested against Ethan's shoulder as he drove with one hand on the wheel and the other linked through hers. August and Nova slept peacefully in their car seats, lulled by the hum of the road and the soft jazz playing on the radio. They reached a quiet overlook just as the sun began to dip behind the ocean. Waves shimmered in gold and the sky turned shades of lavender and apricot. Ethan pulled a blanket from the trunk and laid it across the grass. Celeste sat between his legs, her back against his chest. Her head tilted up as he pressed a kiss into her curls. He whispered, I never knew love could look like this. Celeste smiled. What did you think it looked like? He paused, power, control, safety, but it was never that. She turned to face him, and now, he touched her face gently. Now I know love looks like you like the way you hold pain and still open your heart. Like the way you fight for joy in a world that doesn't always deserve you. Like the way you make me better simply by staying. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a small box. His brow furrowed. What's this? Open it. Inside was a silver compass. Engraved on the back were 5 simple words. Home isn't a place, you... His throat tightened. I thought I was saving you, he whispered. She took his hand. You were, but you didn't realize I was saving you too. As the wind danced across the cliffs and the sun melted into the horizon, Ethan and Celeste sat side by side, their silhouettes framed in light. The future stretched before them, not clean, not predictable, but theirs. And that was enough. More than enough. They had been strangers, then enemies, then reluctant allies, then partners in pain, and now creators of a life neither of them had ever dared to dream. This was not a story about perfection. It was a story about healing, about what happens when love chooses to stay, about the miracle of being known and loved anyway. Dear listener, if this story has touched your heart, if you've ever loved someone through a storm or waited for the dawn after your darkest night, let this be your reminder. You are worthy of the kind of love that stays, the kind that grows in broken places, the kind that doesn't flinch at your scars but traces them with reverence. And if you haven't found it yet, don't give up. Sometimes love's truest victory begins after the fire. Sometimes it begins right here. Thank you for walking this journey with Celeste and Ethan. If their story moved you, take a moment to like, comment, or follow this channel. Your support helps us share more stories of hope, redemption, and love that dares to rise again. Until next time, may your heart be full and your story just beginning.